Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our next book chat with Zainab Kabba as part of the Legacies of Learning project. I'm really honored this afternoon to have Zainab with us to talk about her new book. Welcome, Zainab.
Thank you, Harun.
Welcome. I know you're really busy, so I'm really honored that you've given us your time. Incredibly busy, but it's important that we get to know more about your important book, which was published this year. Just to give a bit of background to yourself for our benefit of our viewers, Zainab Kaba is an educator. She's a writer, a researcher, a strategist with 20 years of experience. She's the founder and CEO of Quotidian Strategies, an Oxford based boutique consultancy firm that provides learning solutions and strategic advising. She's published personal essays and has publications in the areas of public health education, and peace education. We're here to talk about your book. So thank you for joining us, Zainab. It's really important that our viewers get an opportunity to hear what your book is about and you get a chance to speak about your book because it's directly related to our project. So your book is titled "Knowledge, Authority, and Islamic Education in the West: Reconfiguring Tradition." That's the title of the book. I strongly recommend everybody get a copy of the book and they read this wonderful book that I've enjoyed reading over the weekend. So in your book, you draw on immersive fieldwork in the United States, Canada, and Turkey, and you use ethnographic exploration that illuminates the transformative experiences of emerging adult Muslims on their quest for religious knowledge. The book unravels the significance of four residential learning settings, revealing their role as catalysts for reshaping Islamic tradition, delving into the interplay between technology's pervasive influence and the decentralized nature of Islamic interpretation. Zainab Kaba unveils a vibrant tapestry of knowledge producers vying to shape religious understanding and practice among Western Muslims. I'm just going to leave it at that because there's a lot that we want to talk about in your book today. So thank you for writing this book. And like I said, I've really enjoyed reading what you've written there. I want to start with an easy question just to kind of get into it. What inspired you to focus on Islamic education in the West? And how does your personal background, maybe you can give us a bit of a background about your personal life in terms of how it shapes your insight in this book?
Yeah, thanks so much, Harun. Thanks for the invitation to be here and chat with you about the book. I think it's really a great opportunity, just given a lot of the challenges that we're kind of facing in Muslim communities today. The origin story of the book is really come from, my being a part of the Nordies movement of Muslims in going to parts of the Middle East to study Arabic. I finished university. I was very keen on wanting to learn Arabic to better understand Islam, everything that I was sort of taught as a child. And I went to Egypt, and I was in Egypt for 2 years. And during that time, and we hear a lot of these stories from people who've gone to different places in the Middle East, there was very much sort of a disconnect between the types of interpretation that a lot of the teachers talked about when teaching different religious texts, and the way in which I knew my life would unfold or continue to unfold being in the United States. So I was just very keen to kind of understand really just about like application and what it means to kind of learn, know, and then thinking about like applying that. So when I left Cairo, I attended different halaqat, things like that. At that time, I was also doing my master's in computing and education. So I thought it would be really good opportunities for me to explore, Islamic education and technology. And I was really keen on understanding the impact of technology on Islamic education, religious learning, and authority. So it was through kind of like my graduate studies and the different Muslim communities that I was navigating and learning in that I started to really become preoccupied with Muslim learning spaces, different halaqats, conferences, retreats, weekend programs, and wanting to just really understand, what all of this meant, and what does it mean for our lives. Not only kind of this sort of taught obligation of learning and continuing to learn, but really what does it mean in practicality in our everyday living. So pursuing the kind of like a more in-depth understanding of that was really at the forefront of my mind.
Thank you so much for that. It's very fascinating. So, if we just kind of move towards your book, can you tell us a bit more about your study and its sort of methodological framing for the benefit of our viewers?
Yeah. So as I said, I really wanted to I wanted to have an opportunity to kind of like deeply explore, what it looked like for people to go to different places to learn about Islam, and I wanted to focus on American Muslims more broadly. There are a lot of studies that were really looking at Muslims who go overseas to places like Syria, Egypt, Morocco, but I really wanted to look at what this looked like for American Muslims to study in sort of a Western context. So I wanted to have the opportunity to sort of have that deep ethnographic, thick description and deeply understand that. And having the opportunity to be in retreat programs gave me sort of that in depth time in depth of time, the element of travel. So what does this look like in different places? So I was really focused on, following the ideas that were kind of flowing around, and with that the people. So I saw and see. The study kind of in a history and a genealogy of travel and learning that is very much natural to the Islamic tradition. There's a lot of conversations around, thinking about anthropology and what it means to go and study people and that kind of thing. But historical records, travel writings, and that sort of thing, really demonstrate and show that this is very much part of like, a historical tradition of Muslim societies. So I really wanted to kind of think about what it looked like for travel, this is sort of the depth of time and place, and to kind of like unpack that. And then I think, secondly, just really thinking about what the narratives that were really unfolding in these spaces, and that's kind of a key element of the book, and really applying a narrative lens to look at how we understand and think about our place as Muslims in society through and sort of a narrative lens of historical texts, religious texts, and kind of like sociocultural events and happenings.
Thank you. In your book, you explore sort of four sites, if I may, and just for the benefit of our viewers, they may not necessarily be familiar with them. Can you just give them a bit of a background into these sort of places, these spaces that you entered, just for their benefit?
So yeah, I was really, as I said, that element of the time. I didn't want to just go and look at kind of weekend programs or one-off programs. So I looked at what programs offered, a opportunity for me to be able to deeply engage with students and with teachers. And the sites that I chose were Rihla, which is the uh, sorry. The sites that I chose were one, Reviving the Islamic Spirit, RIS, which has a conference and a knowledge retreat annually, and that takes place in Canada. The second was Alim, which is the American Learning Institute for Muslims, which takes place in for during my study. It took place in Michigan. It's since moved or has moved to Chicago and other places, and then as well as the Bayina Dream Program, which is a 9-month Arabic study program in Dallas, Texas. And then lastly, the Rihla retreat program that happens in different places in Muslim majority world. This, for the purposes of my study, I was actually based in Istanbul and Konya in Turkey.
Thank you. Um, I can imagine there might have been some challenges in accessing these sites. So, can you give a sense of a sense of for our viewers of the challenges you might have faced during your fieldwork because you travel. I mean, it was the US, the Canada, and you just mentioned Istanbul, Turkey.
Yeah.
Especially when you're immersing yourself in the lives of your subjects. I mean, this is quite often talked about, discussed in anthropology and ethnographic studies about accessing the site or the field site, if
Mm.
you
Yeah, so RAS and Rihla kind of categorize them as sites that were focused on this idea of preservation of Islamic knowledge and the Islamic tradition, and often kind of communicated about their work in this language of like sacred knowledge. And looking at Alim and Baina, they're very much focused on this sort of like operationalizing of the operationalizing knowledge more broadly. In accessing them, so prior to finishing my first year, so I had once I had decided the sites that I was going to go to, I began to reach out to all of the organizations to explain what I wanted to do. As you know, ethics requirements and approvals, I couldn't just sort of show up and do what I needed to do, but needed to kind of get permission and let them know and be very clear about what I was intending to do. So for some of them, it was easier than others. So this is just in terms of like permission, not let alone getting to those places. So with RAS was probably one of the most challenging. They didn't respond for a number of months. They then kind of sent someone to vet me, if you will, to just, we'll talk a bit about this and kind of the challenges. There was this perception that perhaps maybe I was working for the CIA or the government. People commented on this a few times. Surveillance is not something that's foreign to American Muslim communities, so it's not surprising that that may have been a suspicion. So with RIS as an example, someone vetted me and then sort of gave the approval and then allowed me to attend. They were in some of the other places I was actually able to address the audience more broadly and say what I was doing and allow people to engage with me as they saw fit. But I wasn't able to do that on RIS, and that was a bit of a limitation. With Baina, I have, sort of full disclosure, and I talk a bit about this in my methodological chapter. I have born and raised in New York City, so have sort of knowledge and a historical lens of some of the individuals and peoples that were in spaces of Islamic learning. So I knew of Nouman Ali Khan at the time. I have a personal relationship with his family members of his at the time. So accessing Baina was very easy for me. I sent my information and directly to their administration, and Nouman Ali Khan was, approved that, and that was fine. Rihla also was a bit challenging. Again, getting permission, that also came at the very last minute. And Alim, again, just explaining what I was doing. So it was just a lot of back and forth, and then kind of got permission as well. So that was really helpful. Some of them were really generous and didn't require me to pay any kind of programmatic fee, even though I was there the whole time. So that was different in each of the locations. So that was some of the kind of like challenges in terms of access. Once there were challenges in terms of being able to speak with students, being able to speak with teachers. As I mentioned, in some of the sites, some of the students felt like maybe I was an agent for the government and were reluctant to speak with me. I also had to keep on mentioning and reminding them that I was a researcher. So, what you say to me is, a part of the study, and wanted to make sure like full disclosure of, them knowing what the implications of what they were going to say, of what they said might be. And other places, there was sometimes some gender barriers, but to be fair, there wasn't a lot of that. I didn't really, a lot of the, there wasn't challenges with accessing men's spaces, because in many of these spaces, the men were gender spaces, and me speaking to the men, that also wasn't a challenge, even though I expected that to be a challenge, but that didn't actually turn out to be a serious issue. So I would say the main challenge was that initial access. Once I was in the sites, speaking with students, the main challenge was whether or not I was, going to present them in an unfavorable light, or if I had some sort of nefarious purpose. But other than that, I didn't face significant challenge in terms of what I needed to do. Obviously, given the depth of the work, I was in all of the sites all of the time. I was with students. I was talking to them, talking to teachers. I That was very taxing, I should say, both sometimes from an emotional perspective. I had people break down in interviews. You'd be surprised about when you ask people how did they learn about Islam as a child, what kind of things come up. That was quite surprising. So I had people break down in interviews at times, crying. And then finally, I would say in terms of the teachers, there was some distance where I was told not to speak to certain teachers, not to approach them. In other places, it was quite fine.
Fascinating. If we had more time, I'd get our viewers to hear about all of these really, really fascinating insights that you've touched upon. But once again, once you read the book, you'll get a feeling for this. You talked about getting access, but once you were given access and you were able to speak to the students and get a feel for these spaces that you were able to enter, these programs, what approaches or pedagogies did you find were most effective or, I guess, unique or special that we could probably look at right now?
Yeah, I think, the idea of efficacy is really going to be associated with the end goals or the objectives of the programs. I think in many ways, all of the approaches were effective in doing what they need to do. All of these programs garner thousands, hundreds of students or thousands of students in terms of applications. And the methodology, or the, I would say, the pedagogical skills or techniques that they use are all kind of aligned with those objectives. So, for instance, in Alim, their approach is very much about operationalizing knowledge, like how students can apply to this. They're in this sort of like, we're not telling you, where to, go to shop. We're just saying, when you go to the market, this is what you should be able to do, and you should be able to have some level of discernment. So, there was very much a Socratic method that a number of the teachers used. There was a lot of interrogation, a lot of pushback between student and teacher, and that is very much aligned, and I think some degree of effectiveness with the end goal on wanting what they want students to be able to achieve. In Baina, similarly, that was an Arabic program. The students really, I saw them go from not having a lot of knowledge of Arabic to, at the end of that course, really being able to. A lot of that had to do with the charisma of the teacher. There was a lot of there's a lot of call and response methods in terms of the in classroom pedagogy, and the memorization, all these kind of things that we know are kind of needed for language acquisition. But obviously, alongside that, particularly as it relates to Baina, there was very much the approach is very much like a DIY type thing, right? Because throughout the book, what I am essentially saying is that the ways in which the teachers position themselves and their histories is what shows up in the programs as kind of like the best way in which you can kind of actualize yourself or become, the best Muslim that you can be, or the Muslim that they're saying is the best way in which you should kind of inhabit the world. So in that way, students were very much kind of pushed to, think about the different meanings and what this might mean, and for them to test out ideas and to give their own little khutbahs or khatiras and that sort of thing. And as opposed to, some place like RIS and the retreat, which is very much about a passive kind of a recipient of knowledge, and students are kind of watching teachers go through this sort of archival approach of, disinterring a lost identity of what it means to be a Muslim, and then creating and shaping for them what that looks like, and then thinking about, well, okay, how can you then emulate this, rather than think about the ways in which you will apply it differently in your context. So there's a range of approaches, and I think what's interesting about all of them, in many ways, is there's, we're using the same source material for different aims. So the way in which we'll think about the stories of the prophet and the seerah, in, let's say, alim, is, a very different from how that might come across in ras, where this is sort of like a really great lesson for you to think about, as opposed to how can you then apply this lesson in the different contexts in which you're in.
Thank you for that. Fascinating. In your book, you emphasize that Islamic authority is relational. Can you elaborate on how this relational approach to authority is reshaping the dynamics within Muslim learning communities?
Yeah. So I think, when I started out this work, and, just the way in which we speak about authority in everyday language, it's, this person is considered authoritative, or, he or she has authority. And through the, looking at the different sites, and also how kind of learning and these relationships unfold in the sites, what became clear is that the no one has authority as like a starting point. And when I say that, I'm not talking about someone in a bureaucratic position or functional authority where you have a role or you're an employee or that kind of thing, but more of in this sort of general idea of general, sorry, kind of environment of religious learning. People have certain characteristics. They have a certain background, they have a certain education, they are from a specific country, they're a specific gender, they dress a certain way, they are a certain age. All of these things is what I say allows authority to begin to take shape. So authority emerges and or forms when the speaker starts to speak and the listener is present to hear them speak. When there is a almost like a combination click of all of those things and characteristics of the teacher and the needs of the student, when that kind of um, sort of like everything aligns, that is where I say that there is a sort of authority is then formed, because the student now sees the teacher as legitimate, and then they're kind of sourcing them for guidance. The teacher is constantly then calibrating themselves to the needs of the students in order to actually have that authority take shape and take form, rather than the teacher sort of shows up already and then the student listens to them, and then authority kind of came into the room. But rather, what I'm saying is that authority is formed through this sort of encounter and the combination of characteristics and needs that align with one another.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And I will chase you up later for a conversation more on authority because I'm writing a chapter on authority as we speak. Um, in your afterword, you introduced a concept. It's a very interesting concept, actually, of the Muslim educational industrial complex. Could you explain what you mean by this term and how you see it impacting the future of Islamic education?
Yes. So, what kind of becomes apparent, and I think in many ways we can kind of all see this from the day to day ways in which people learn. So, when I was speaking with students, and this I would say sort of took shape and started from my graduate studies, when I was doing my master's, really trying to understand how technology was changing the ways in which learning happens and unfolds, and who we consider to be sources that we should go to in order to consider developing an authoritative relationship. The kind of social media landscape has really shifted the way in which we think about things, and I should also say, really under capitalism, that also has an impact. And what, again, throughout the book, what I'm trying to press upon the reader is that the Muslim community is a subset of the larger American Muslim society. That means the issues, the concerns, all of the challenges that beset the general society are going to have an impact in the Muslim community, and they may manifest themselves in different ways. So, what you see happening with the consistent development of new educational programs, institutions, individuals, is this constant sourcing of an audience to connect to have a relationship, often one that has financial implications. So, what I've kind of termed as the Muslim education industrial complex is the intersection of sort of three industries. One, what I call is like a faith infused wellness complex. Second, a American celebrity culture, and the sort of uh, alignment and how that then kind of goes into the social media creator economy. So what you then see is that Islamic knowledge and really all of these programs and the sites that I studied, they're all they have a cost. All of these institutions are not nonprofit organizations. Some of them are companies. So Bayina was a company. RIS is a for-profit company. That's not the case for Alim and for Alim, RIS. These are RIS, I believe, is nonprofit as well. These are paid programs that come with a considerable price tag. The people in them, and some of them are paid, and others there aren't. But there is this sort of burgeoning complex of Muslim speakers, teachers, programs that are using Islamic knowledge, and I'll unpack that a bit in a second. Islamic knowledge as the commodity in which they're selling. Muslims are taught, and we are taught to kind of seek knowledge from cradle to the grave. There is such a high value placed on knowledge, and this in some ways creates this like perfect opportunity for an insatiable amount of like learning that you then have to continue to seek, and this all comes with a price tag. When I in talking about Islamic knowledge, it is not just sort of a focus on kind of like the text. There is, I say Muslim education primarily given the sort of attentiveness to develop sort of a Muslim identity. And at times that may or may not have an association with specific or very core religious texts, even though the Quran and Sunnah are always going to be sort of like the foundational basis for that. So in looking at kind of the intersection of these three different industries, we sort of see this massive proliferation of individuals that kind of just come into this system to offer learning products of some sort to Muslims who have been taught from childhood that you must seek knowledge. And this idea that knowledge is the only way to kind of achieve, God consciousness and also the favor of God, makes this sort of continuous, this system sort of continue to kind of grow, and widen its reach.
Thank you. That's so fascinating because on my own research, of course, as you're aware, and our readers and viewers are aware, it's about seminaries and Darul Ulooms in the UK, and which arguably work on a very different model, if anything. But what do you believe these intensive learning programs that you were able to observe and write about offer that traditional religious schooling or mosques might not be able to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I talk about this in the book as well, and this is specifically in thinking about adult education and adult Muslim learning. We're kind of in an ecosystem of learning. And there are different things that, different sort of learning needs that people have at different phases of our lives. And, I was able to see that in my research, where sometimes I would speak to one student who's in, one program, and then they said, "Oh, yeah, I've been to those other programs that you're looking at as well." So some of them may have gone through all of those programs, but at different phases of their life because of the different needs that they may have had at the time for where they were in sort of like their, identity or the developmental stages of life. I think what the sort of the intensive programs offer people is one, and this is also something that's sort of very much kind of like sold in the packaging. There's this um, uh, ability, this desire to kind of step away, right? Take a break from the everyday world and kind of go somewhere and just focus on you and your relationship with Allah, with other people who are also looking to do similar things. And I think that has a certain value and interest for people. I think second, there's this kind of way in which people see their personal encounters with scholars and this idea of suhba, or observing scholars in their everyday or with them, that this provides like a sense of learning as well. And many of the students talked about going to these spaces in order to obtain that as well. And then thirdly, I think there is very much this a relationship with other students that you will get from these encounters. What I see overall that these programs all offer is that we have to recognize that there's a lot of noise, and I think we all kind of see that there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of information that is out in the ecosystem of like Muslim learning. These programs really offer a curation of knowledge for students that allows them to focus. So again, once there's this sort of combination and formation of authority, students then are very happy to be able to have someone that they see and that they trust to sort of curate a kind of learning experience that's going to lead them to the goals that they have. And I think I would say broadly, what these retreat programs, at times I think, I would say most of the students that I had spoken to really felt happy, and that they had gotten what they had wanted out of them. And we'll talk a bit more about later about like what this means for Muslim learning into the future. But there's, we don't really have an understanding of the sort of longitudinal impact or effects of these types of programs. It's not to say that the immediate kind of impact that they have on students at that phase in their life isn't useful, but what does this mean more broadly to the ecosystem? And should we, think about, changing, switching, or whatever that means? What happens? I think part of the limitations also of these programs is that all these programs skew young. So after a certain age, and we can look at the ecosystem and really see this, after a certain age, after you're kind of out of that like emergent adulthood, programs don't cater to older people who are more professional, who are, maybe in their 30s, who now have families, who now have children, who are, maybe running company, that they're in a different phase of life. These students are in an emerging kind of adulthood phase of life where they're concerned about their identity. They're, aspirationally thinking about what they're going to be doing with their lives. Marriage is a key preoccupation. So this is I think the programs kind of attend to students at that phase of life. But after that, thinking about thereafter, we don't really see a lot of that in being attended to in the ecosystem more broadly.
Thank you very much. So clearly, there's a tension between seeking knowledge and the commodification of it. Um, how do you think this affects the authenticity or quality of education or Islamic education in your own view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, I said perhaps crassly to one of the teachers that sometimes it feels like this is like drug dealing, where someone needs to go, they need to get a hit because they're feeling a certain way. Once they get that hit, they're good for a certain amount of time. Once they start going, the high goes down, they then need to go on to the next program. I think there is a tension when people's livelihoods, and what I mean the livelihoods of scholars, are tied to the amount of people that are in the seats. That the booking out the halls, the program selling out, that sort of thing. When that is tied to whether or not your electricity stays on or your children are able to go on a holiday, I think that is a complicated tension to think about. It really then, as I was saying earlier, this constant recalibration that is necessary then to keep people attentive to your message is concerning. And what does that what is the impact of that on what the teacher is sharing, how they go about doing that, the different tools that they use. All of this, I think, is something that's worth kind of like deeply considering. I don't know whether or not I would comment on whether that makes something authentic or inauthentic, because I think there's a deeper kind of analysis that's needed depending upon who is teaching and what. But I think it does complicate things and really makes one question, or should I would say make one question more in depth what the person is saying and what the implications of it are for the listener, but also for the stability and livelihood of the teacher.
Thank you so much for that. You write about the influence of charismatic teachers like Hamza Yusuf and Noman Ali Khan in particular. What do you think is the most critical factor behind their popularity and influence?
Yeah, I think so at the start of my study, I sort of administered a survey that I've not really fully kind of unpacked the numbers or the quantitative data that's associated with that in any serious way. And maybe that's something that I'm looking into doing. Um, Things shift over time. And, this is what I was saying earlier in reference to kind of the features and the characteristics and how they shift or need to shift in order to maintain the audience. So someone like, I would say at the start of my study. So again, this is we're talking about 2013. 2013. Yeah, 2013. When I was speaking to students, I would say that Hamza Yusuf and Noman Ali Khan, in many ways, were sort of, neck and neck, if you will, and how students saw them in terms of their popularity. Now we have to understand Hamza Yusuf, as you are well aware, and many people know, is older than Noman Ali Khan, and his trajectory has been very different and has shifted and changed over the last 20 years. Whereas Noman Ali Khan is a newer face at that time, a newer face in the industrial complex, and was really speaking to a different type of student. So I would say the same things made them popular to their audiences. So there is this dexterity with the Arabic language, and given the high value that we associate with Arabic language, the ability to weave in and out of English and Arabic is that the performative nature of that is very compelling for people to see and to witness, and it's aspirational. And in many ways, when then Nouman Khan then creates a program that says, "Well, you can do this too," it's no wonder why then people would kind of think about signing up for that because of that element of it. I think there is an attentiveness to a certain type of Americanness. I think, Hamza Yusuf's reliance on, I shouldn't say reliance, but his usage of different, American literature, classical literature that many people have, read in their years in school, is also quite unique and fascinating for people. Comparatively, there is because of the age of Naman Ali Khan, his youthfulness was attractive to students because he was able to talk about his challenges living as a South Asian boy or South Asian boy in New York City, and in many ways these students are dealing with similar challenges. So this, again, that's where this kind of like alignment comes. It's like, oh, there's all of these little things sort of make a difference, and I think that becomes very attractive to students. And I think that there is um, there's a level of, I think, like acceptance, I would say, on Aman Ali Khan's part of recognizing that things are challenging, but you can kind of get past it, just like me. His whole approach is very autodidactic. You can do this, I can do this, I'm self taught, you can be self taught, this kind of approach. Self taught, I use that loosely because obviously he's now stepping in place of a teacher for them, even though he is self taught, but they're not then going to be self taught. As opposed to Hamza Yusuf, who comes from this sort of tradition and this ijaza system and the way in which he situates himself. So in comparing them, it's very it's very interesting because in many ways they're total opposites, but at the same time they're very much the same. Where Nouman Khan is self-studied, and then Hamza Yusuf is coming from this sort of ijaza system, and I think it kind of then just that those two, the comparison of the two of them, show and kind of demonstrate that it is that sort of calibration of characteristics that's kind of associated with the audiences. Because in many ways, one would think, well, it has to be either one or the other. You can't be come from nowhere and just sort of say that I'm learned and now start teaching people, and then people find that attractive. How is that possible? And then for you to be making all this money doing that, and then for Hamza Yusuf to be on the other camp being like, well, you're not really going to be considered someone who has authenticity if you don't come from this tradition. So I think that both of their learning journeys are what make them attractive to their audiences. Their dexterity with the language in that regard, and the element of their Americanness, where Hamza Yusuf is, a white American, normally kind of South Asian, and those kind of sort of social positionings, again, to each of their audiences, is what makes them also attractive.
Thank you very much. I want to move on and reflect upon the role of technology. Traditionally, people would learn by going to literally sit at the feet of the teacher, and
Mhm.
you've seen that in your own research that you're doing. But increasingly, we're seeing modern technology. We're talking over an online app where we don't have to be in person. How do you see modern technology both challenging but also, I guess, supporting traditional Islamic authority structures? And if I could just put in a question alongside that, what role do you think social media and digital platforms play in democratizing Islamic knowledge? And do you see any sort of risks or even advantages that might stem from this?
Yeah, I think that what social media has allowed is that the social media and the internet more broadly is access for everyone to position themselves as someone who's looking to form an authoritative relationship. And I think that is both has is both good and bad. And I think in the context of my conceptualization of this Muslim education industrial complex, it's really about the mechanisms and systems that are going to be a part of that that are going to determine how good or bad actually this is. As I kind of say within the book, that the industrial complex is unregulated. There is no systems of accountability. There are no barriers to entry for anyone. You have to, again, just find your audience, position yourself in the right way, and can sort of have that combination click. So I think in the one hand, that is really a great opportunity for voices that are often marginalized, that are often muted, that may not necessarily have all of the prescribed bells and whistles that we are taught should be present, and in some ways that then gives an opportunity for people who have different messages than what are naturally or have normally been available. So I think that there is a great opportunity for providing alternative narratives and ways in which we can kind of understand what it means to sort of live life as a Muslim in contemporary in the United States. At the same time, I think as we can see in with all of the rise, or I would say, like, rather than rise, but perhaps like the consistent disclosures that we have of abuse happening in student teacher relationships or in learning circles. This primarily, as I was saying earlier, is due to the unregulated nature of the industrial complex, and that there are no ways in which people are, we're thinking or talking about how to recognize harm, problematic things, etc. So I think that it's both. It is, in thinking about this democratizing knowledge, I think that there is an opportunity for people to present alternatives. At the same time, it becomes really problematic when there are no discerning elements or characteristics that allow people to be able to foresee or to kind of see harm that might occur. I think the other thing is there is people often say technology is neutral, and you just you use it and it's fine. But I think there's a problem with that kind of approach. And people are like, well, the technology is here, we should use it for good. But the as we see more and more from evidence-based research and empirical studies about the impacts and influences of social media, the design of the social media platforms, the algorithmic nature of the ways in which information is presented, shared, and proliferates has negative consequences, but also runs counter to the articulated aims of Islamic education that many of the speakers or teachers talk about. So I think there is a very deep tension in thinking about what it means to create learning messages where the intention is to improve the lives or to impact the people's lives for good, on platforms that are fundamentally structured to do the opposite, to create this sort of addiction, which we know, and don't necessarily change behavior for the better or keep us distant from a more deeper understanding of religion that is really aimed to change behavior in a very deep way. So I think in many ways there need to be, and this is where I feel in many ways some of the in-person programs then provide that kind of opportunity. But the independence or the the programs are not separate from social media. They use social media to advance themselves, if you will. So, I saw this in many times. There are tensions in the program. So you'll go into a program, Rihla as an example, and I talk about this in the book, and students start out and they're told, don't be on social media. You're here to study, focus your time. You're here for 3 weeks. Don't do that. But then the administration of the program, administrators, are taking pictures, putting them on social media. They then ask students, if you're going to take pictures, can you make sure that you tag us on social media? So they want to then show this is the experience because they want to market the program. But then you've just kind of erased in some ways the foundational elements that you said are really important for Islamic learning. So there's a lot of these tensions that kind of come up, both in terms of like, technology, how, even, language, as sort of like a side note, and very much like this was often the case when you be at, I was in Albania during the Arabic program. And again, I talk about this in the book, where the students are taught to, show off their Arabic. And, when people see you speaking in this way, they're going to be impressed. But then at the same time, the students are told, actually, no, you shouldn't, don't show that off. But then they're also told, oh, people all over the world want to be here. And the reason why they're saying that is because Noman Ali Khan's popularity due to social media then is what actually brought all those students there. So there's this almost like you don't have a choice in using that, but that tension then remains. And I think really what is then required for Muslim educational programs is to really think about how to communicate to audiences or to share learning without thinking or having that kind of reliant solely on the social media. This idea of like bigger is better and more and that kind of thing. All of this, again, as I said, we're kind of situated within this capitalist system. We're in this sort of like social media creator economy. Videos that have more views are monetized, so then they're going to give you more money. That means you want to make videos really compelling. You need to pull out things that are going to be really flashy, and so all of these things have an impact on what you're doing, because fundamentally, if we're asking ourselves, okay, well, what is the best way in which to kind of impact students? Is this sort of preoccupation with virality in order to kind of become more popular and to gain more money the actual purpose of the programs more broadly?
This is such a fascinating conversation because there's always that tension. You've alluded to it quite clearly here, where you're trying to provide education that spiritually, morally connects people to God. There's a theological, theocentric idea to it, but there's also the tension of trying to attract more students, and the pervasiveness and the perils, if you like, of technology.
And I would say, Harun, I think part of that is because I think part of that is impacted due to the preoccupation and our kind of situatedness within globalization. We've moved to a globalizing way of being, but there's very much the opportunity to become localized. We see this now, even with everything that's happened with the American election, where people are saying, listen, we need to organize locally, we need to focus on our communities. In many ways, I think there are lessons for, Islamic educators to think about and what that means. This desire to be on the internet, to be global in order to get more students, in order to make more money or to make money. I think it really needs to be questioned. What does it look like for Islamic learning to have a localized approach? This might in some ways sort of mitigate some of the issues around harm and abuse. Potentially, people are going to people in their communities. People then maybe are traveling to live in different communities. It's something to consider, rather than the sort of the standardization of the globalized approach.
And you've also alluded to some of the more recent abuse cases that have happened. Primarily, I assume it happened through technology. So, even though technology creates a distance, it still doesn't create the distance that protects people from immoral or these sort of behaviors. So again, technology, as you said, it's not neutral. It can be used by the subject in very in different ways, I guess, which is something that you've alluded to. Sadly, we've had some recent cases, and I guess technology allows that. Sometimes it gives that freedom for these sort of things to happen. Sadly,
Yeah, and I think the technology gives it creates proximity and closeness, which is the again, this is the intent. And then again, thinking about that within the wider decision or desire to create learning spaces. We have all of these, we have WhatsApp, we have Telegram, and people are like, oh, I'm going to get on X scholars Telegram group, right? And then all of your information is in that group, right? So there's a desire to use the technology to create local communities, to create more intimacy, to create proximity. And I think what I'm interrogating is, in some ways, what does that mean about the communities in which these people are situated, and why is it from the outside in, or rather than thinking about where people are situated and what it means to do that. But because of this whole, as I was saying, sort of like the celebrity nature, people then are created these sort of parasocial relationships with people online, and then are seeking every opportunity to become as close to them as possible. So as soon as X scholar creates a WhatsApp group, somebody's on it. As soon as someone is, going to create some short program, of course people are on it, because of like the element of this of celebrity that the internet kind of solidifies and further agendas.
Hmm. Excellent. In your opinion, what's the most pressing expectation that younger Muslims bring to these educational spaces? And if I could just combine that with another question, what characteristic or skills do you believe are crucial for Islamic educators today, given the culture and social shifts we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think, with that first question and thinking about what the youth bring to these spaces, again, I think it depends on where they are in their developmental cycles. And again, what is happening in the world at the time. So, at the time when I was doing this study, these students are students that have essentially grown up post 9/11. They're kind of grappling with, what it means for them to be Muslim. I know you had like Nadeem Maiman on your podcast last month, and his earlier works kind of like talks about this sort of moving from like learning Islam to learning how to be Muslim post 9/11, and really seeing that shift. So there is the importance of recognizing what is happening at the time in the lives of the students, and essentially that's what then they're then bringing to these spaces, and that means that they are then searching for people who are being attentive to this. So at that time, where these children, where these students are 20, 21, or 19, they're like just going into university. They potentially are going to take courses of people who are teaching Islamic studies. How should they then deal with that? They're going to be encountering people and having relationships with other genders. What does that kind of mean for them? So this is thinking about developmentally. They're looking at their lives. They're thinking about their careers, potentially all these kinds of things now. And I'm sort of working on a project now to be talking to these students now 10 years later, where they have children, they are married, they're deep in their careers. What does all of this kind of learning look like for them? At that time, these were the type of concerns and issues that they're bringing. If we ask those same students now, sorry, if we ask students of that same age now kind of what their preoccupations are, they're going to be somewhat different. We have right now, we are going into Trump season 2. We are in a sort of, again, rehashing and thinking about the Me Too movement, all of the things that are happening with the war, the wars and the genocide in Gaza. So students have been then looking for teachers to give them answers on how they should see these things. How should I vote, as an example? What does this mean for me to vote for Trump or to vote for Kamala Harris? Thinking about what where they should be working. People that have been in jobs where they then find out that they're party to sort of like genocide funding, issues that are related to kind of thinking about scandals. People are like, what teacher should I go to? How do I know if somebody is going to be harmful? So there are these and this kind of goes back to my earlier point of like the necessity of looking about at the socio-political and cultural events that are happening, and that's essentially what students are going to show up to those spaces with. There's a lot of students are are depressed, they're facing mental health issues, there's suicide happening in Muslim communities, people who are struggling with sexual identity. These are all the things that are going to show up in communities in these spaces, because that's essentially what's happening in the wider society. So as we kind of like see over time, I know with my work, I was kind of at that point in time. We didn't, Me Too hadn't started. We're just sort of 10 years after 9/11. Um, but now I think there are a different set of issues that would come up. But underneath all of that is students trying to figure out how they need to then operationalize the things that they know for their everyday lives.
Thank you. Just one more question. I know we've had a lot of to talk about. Are there any particular areas within Islamic education authority, based on your detailed research, and I know you're doing some work now, that you hope will receive more attention or research in the future?
Okay, sorry, I realized I didn't answer your earlier question about what Islamic educators and skills should think about. Islamic educators and skills should have now. I think to answer that question, I think what the key things that I think are quite important are a recognition that, again, the what's happening in society. Fundamentally, the scholars, teachers that need to live in the real world. What is actually happening in the real world, and deeply understanding that in order to actually address what is happening in the lives of students. I think the second thing is really about staying in your lane. We hear this all the time. There is a focus and a core preoccupation with religious texts, and that as being the only way in which we kind of understand the world. I think it's important for the value of the kind of like religious scholars who are able to do the textual interpretations to be present and in conversations, but there needs to be more attentiveness to valuing and in some ways establishing some degree of equity amongst people who are scholars of practice, who are scholars of specific subject matters, and really thinking about that as sort of like an ecosystem of learners that are, or teachers that are trying to address the interest and the needs of learners more broadly. Um, in relation to your last question was about.
My question was about building on your research and Islamic Education Authority, and how you hope, and areas that you hope will receive more attention for research in the future.
Yeah, I think I would love to see more longitudinal studies, or any longitudinal studies, I should say, on the topics that we sort of see in these types of spaces, again, in adult learning spaces, that are of intensive nature, and thinking about the ecosystem in that way. So longitudinal studies, thinking about um, how we are learning and what we are learning over time topically, and the impact that that is having on Muslim communities more broadly. I think second, I would like to see sort of a deeper socio-political analysis of the relationship between, what we hear and see in Muslim learning spaces and what is happening in wider society. And I would like to see a kind of a deeper analysis of almost the pedagogical and educational philosophies of these scholars in these spaces over time, and the impact that that has, what and how things influence them, and the ways in which that changes through time. Like we can see that very clearly. There are studies that have been done on Hamza Yusuf's thought in that way, and I think we need more of that across the board with other religious scholars.
Thank you very much for that, Zainab. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I've really enjoyed reading your book. I highly recommend everyone gets a copy of her book, Knowledge, Authority, and Islamic Education in the West, Reconfiguring Tradition. I hope that you can publish more books so we can benefit more from your expertise and your knowledge. As always, wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Zainab. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Haran.
You're welcome. As for our viewers, we hope you've enjoyed this particular book chat. Please do follow and make some comments if you're able to do so at the end of this video. We'd love to hear from you. This is part of the Legacies of Learning project, generously funded by the Jameel Foundation, where we try to think about questions that are important to Muslims and civilization today in light of Islamic history, Islamic thought of the past, and how we can make that speak to some of the concerns that Muslims are facing today. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.